Welcome back. So we'll do just a slight review of the previous studies. We saw the origin of the conservative mind began in Lucifer in heaven. He rejected the new light, the new information, and wanted to preserve, to conserve, or to return back to the original government of God, which he was not in competition with Jesus Christ. It resulted in rebellion against God's government. Then we trace the history of colonial America up to 1798, showing the mindset of the times in regard to church and state, gender roles, slavery, discrimination, and saw that the Lord did a progressive work of cracking the mindsets of the time through various people and organizations that brought freedom of worship and freedom of conscience. And it was fighting against the 1260 darkness, which we use prophetically as a symbol. So now I want to look at the Christian right and Dominionism. And I came across Dominionism as I was looking into the Project Blitz study, and it took me to the religious right, which then took me to the Dominionism. So I had to put the other one on hold and go to the Dominionism. I've not really known anything about that. But it's been a theological belief for over 50 years. So, but it's not known. And I consider it the underbelly of the Christian right in that not everybody in the Christian right movement knows that this exists, that this is the end game of what I'm going to explain of what their goal is to create a theocratic nation and dispose of the Constitution, or actually remove it from its place and make the Bible the standard of law using the Constitution. So this is what we'll look at. I have up there in the top left-hand corner are just a few resources that I use to find out what's going on with the Christian right. And again, I want to keep this in our mind about the mindset, and then information, disinformation, and misinformation, because there's a lot of that going on. The Christian right is a loose network of political actors, religious organizations, and they're also political pressure groups. And they have really been growing over time. They were very quiet in the 1920s, up until the 1920s. They got beat up for the Scopes monkey trial, where they took a teacher to trial, sued the school because he was teaching Darwinism. And the fundamentalists won the case, but they lost the case. It was a Pyrrhic win, in that they lost their standing in the nation. They were looked upon as kooks and as backward, because this new teaching, new higher criticism of the Bible was coming in, different ways of studying, and it was called the liberal method of studying the Bible. And they, of course, are fundamentalists. And so you had that war going on in the early 20s up into the 50s. And that's where we get the fundamentalists. They stick to the fundamentals of the Bible. Okay. So let me give you a definition of Dominionism. Dominionism is the theocratic idea that regardless of theological view, means, or timetable, so it doesn't matter how long it takes or what it takes, okay? Christians are called by God to exercise dominion over every aspect of society by taking control of political and cultural institutions. There are various levels of dominionism. There's hard dominionists and soft dominionists, and I'll get into that later. What I found also is how they look at the United States. Number one, they celebrate Christian nationalism. It's in the notes. Thank you. So Christian nationalism means they merge Christianity with the American identity. So in other words, to be a good patriot, you have to be a Christian. And if you're not, then you're not a good patriot. So they blend this together because they believe America is a Christian nation. In fact, this is the next statement. They believe the United States was and should once again be a Christian nation. So the fact that they see America as not a Christian nation now, they see it as a bad thing. So they're in a battle because they believed from the beginning that America was a Christian nation, and now the liberal left has ruined it for us Christians now, because we are restricted in our religious rights to express our faith in the public market. They deny the Enlightenment roots of American democracy. Remember what we saw in our history line in the last study. The light that was coming out, new thinking, new ideas, freedom, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. They also promote religious superiority. So they do not tolerate anybody else. And they will be considered minorities and treated accordingly. They endorse theocratic visions of the nation. Now again, not every Christian right person knows this. Granny sitting in the pew of the Baptist church would not say that she's a dominionist, but she would agree with a lot of their thinking in that, yeah, we're a Christian nation and we need to have more protection and we need prayer back in school and Bible and all these things. So they have a lot of general tenets that they agree on. They also have a lot of social issues that draw them in without really knowing what the end game is for the leaders of organizations that have a dominionist goal for the nation. They believe the Ten Commandments, or biblical law, should be the foundation of American law, and that the U.S. Constitution is the vehicle for implementing that law. And of course, that takes a distinct form in the United States, but there are various forms of it around the world. So there's two streams of the mainstream of dominionism. It's been around for 50 years. It's not understood, and it's not widely known. They've been very stealth in what they've done. So the prominent politicians' involvement in dominionism has only started showing in the last 50 years, and it leaks out in their interviews. When you start understanding their language and how they frame things in their new definition of what religious liberty is and how it's being restrained or even trampled on, you can see behind the words who they are and what they're headed to, because they frame things like Satan did, to make it look like it's for the good of the universe, to make it look like it's good for the nation, that they're here to protect their rights, they're here to recover their rights, they're here to stand up for God. So it's very dangerous, but they have a wide following of many different denominations. It's important for us to know who they are and what they are so we can recognize them when we read things in the news, when we see different politicians having interviews and talking about their political aspirations. There was an article, I don't know if I have it, that was just recent. Here it is. In March of 2018, there was an NRA, the Rifle Association meeting, being held in Trump's Washington hotel. And the media wrote all about it. But what they didn't write about it was that there was another conference going on, and it was the Christian right leaders and top Dominionist leaders. And you might recognize some of these names. I've heard of some of them, but it's been a long time. Dutch Sheets, Chuck Pierce, Cindy Jacobs, and Lou Engle. They are some of the top Dominionist leaders. And they are associated with this thing called, and I didn't write it up here, but it's also part of Dominionism. It's the New Apostolic Association? Reformation, thank you. And that's connected to the Latter Rain movement from long ago. They believe a triumphant, dominion-taking church will help bring the return of Christ. So now you see that their objective, their goal, their mandate is that they have to do something in order to bring Christ back. So they feel they have a very important part, and they are the new apostles and the new prophets. And they believe that President Trump was anointed for his position by God to help them bring back Christ. In 2015, Right Wing Watch pointed out, we must realize that Dutch Sheets had said, we must realize that we are God's governing force on the earth, which have been given keys of authority from Him to legislate from the spiritual realm. That is so dangerous because they interpret the Bible literally. So now we know how they're going to legislate homosexuality, how they're going to legislate social issues, abortion rights, all these different issues that are now being fought out in the public arena. They already have a mandate on how those things will be legislated, and they're looking at the death penalty. So they're serious. They're very serious. And of course now they believe that because Trump is appointed of God, that anybody who goes against him is an enemy because he can do no wrong. He's been anointed by God to be the leader. And so now anything that anybody says that shows any kind of truth and veracity of facts is automatically dismissed. And why? Because they have a fixed mental attitude or disposition that predetermines a person's, I forgot a word, response to and interpretation of situations. So they have this mindset, and it's strong. It's so strong, they are going to believe that when they're killing people who are not of the Christian right mindset, that they are doing God's service. And we know that's in the scriptures, and we know that's prophetically true. They have no, what Sister White say? They have no idea where this is leading them. Okay, there was a director for the Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Dominionists are the most extreme faction of the religious right. They're people who literally embrace the concept of theocratic government. Rob Boston said, they are the latter-day Puritans.
Sister, you're reading from your own notes too?
Yes, my own notes.
Okay.
I can email these to you later. I found all this afterwards.
Okay.
Sorry.
We're looking forward to it.
Yeah, okay. They are the latter-day Puritans with modern-day technology, and they would make this country officially Christian one by force if necessary. And of course, their definition of Christianity is so extreme that it would exclude millions of Americans who attend mainline churches. What unites the religious right is the theocratic vision. That is their mission. They feel called. That's what makes, and they are upbeat and eager to be doing this because of those things that have happened on that line that we'll get to. This movement goes by different names. They can be Reconstructionists, there's Dominionists, and then Seven Mountain Dominionists. But they want to replace the Republican form of government with a Christian fundamentalist theocracy. So their goal is to tear down and reconstruct from the ground up using biblical lines. Yes?
So what we learned on the first lesson is it's actually repeating itself. What the churches did way back then because they thought they were right and they wanted us to live their way because it was the only
Exactly.
way to stay close to God.
So we've gone along and we got church separation of church and state, and they're taking us back. And many of them, I have quotes that they say that separation of church and state is a myth. It's not valid. The founders intended church and state to be together. I mean, they have taken everything of our history and turned it to match their mindset, their theology. Mm-hmm. Excuse me.
That worked so well in Europe for 1200 years. So we're going to be the Quakers?
Yeah. Good point. The writings of a man named John Rushdoony, he wrote a book called Dominion Men, and he was a Reconstructionist. Reconstructionism isn't a real denomination or movement, but it is a theology or a teaching that Dominionists use because he actually wrote an 800-page book that gives the justification, based on the Bible, gives justification on why Christians should create a theocratic nation. That we have a mandate, and he went through all the Bible and connected it with American history and showed that this is what we are to do and this is how you do it. And that's their kind of operating manual. But he laid the philosophical groundwork for the rise of the religious right and gave the biblical justification for intervention in politics. Before then, Christians would not venture into this. So they have this fringe group of Christians by name, and they are at war. They share things that they are at war with modern life. They refuse to accept things like women's liberation, LGBTQ rights, secular public schools, religious pluralism, democracy, modern science, higher education, biblical criticism, liberal Christianity, and non-theistic belief systems, and so on. If possible, they would return to the 6th century Byzantine Empire if possible. In fact, they would take us by putting far-right judges on the Supreme Court. They would move the country back to 1950 if possible. And can you say, make America great again? Because that's what Trump's mind is. The 50s was the great time. That's when we still had prayer in school. We had Bible reading in school. Everybody was patriotic, and the women were in the kitchen, and they were staying home, and the men were the breadwinners, and all of that. That's their vision of Make America Great. And it is these people who are taken with Donald Trump. They have hitched themselves to him in spite of his failings and his immorality, but they believe because he's a flawed vessel that God will use him as a wrecking ball to reconstruct the nation in the image that they have designed.
That's incredible. He's such a bully and a brat and a mean guy, but they still want to have him support him.
Because he's fighting for them. If you see the legislation that he's putting through.
They link it to prosperity. They link Christianity to prosperity. prosperity
Yes.
in the 50s.
Yes.
So that's why they're electing him because he's rich because
And by the way, these people that started these organizations, the Christian organizations, they made a lot of money. Because the FCC changed the way programming could be done in the United States. Sunday was always public service shows.
So you can actually see the call to restore prosperity to the nation.
And Trump is a,
Whereas we thought that that's something that's coming up, but it's been happening.
right. And Trump is a prosperity gospel person because he was tutored under, what's that guy, Positive Thinking?
Robert Schuller?
No. Who?
Oh, not Robert Schuller.
No, not Robert Schuller.
Tony.
Not Joel Osteen. He's an older guy.
Neil.
No.
Okay, we'll think about it. Because his book was called the Life of Positive Thinking, or
Something Neil.
Norman Vincent Peale. Thank you, we got it. So that's what he grew up under.
And he trained Robert Schuller.
Yes.
And Robert Schuller trained.
And so Trump's all about prosperity. Look at his life, right? That's all it's about. And that's what makes you a successful person. If you don't succeed financially, wealth-wise, you're a failure. You're a loser. So they all are creating this perfect marriage.
Church and state.
Yes. And prosperity for the select few. So, okay, that was written in March of 2018. I mean, they're boasting at how many times they'll call the White House, and the White House will take their calls, these evangelical right-wing leaders. They've said, we've never had such an open door to the White House ever. And they're drunk on the power and the prestige of having that.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That makes me think of the Magna Carta in some ways, because it was to allow liberty, but it was for the few, the wealthy, the rich, for only the ones able to partake in I guess freedom or something, freedom in certain things, and the peasants, the poor peasants, and all of them, they didn't have that luxury, or they didn't have that.
So there was division. Selective, yes, yes. Then this article was written in 2010, which I find really fascinating. That's almost 10 years ago, so the Stones have been crying out. And this is called Dominionism and the Religious Right, the Merger is Complete. So this man basically is saying that there's a number of leaders, and you mentioned, Elaine, Lance Wallnau? Wallnau, yeah. He's been around a long time, and he's a big guy in this movement. But this writer was talking about how he wasn't sure if this merge had really happened, but now he's convinced that the Seven Mountain Mandate and the religious right have joined together. Lance Wallnau is the biggest leader promoting all of this, and they have this, we're taking the territory of the United States, because in the Bible, Genesis 1:28, we are to have dominion over the earth. Unfortunately, Jesus has said, my kingdom is not of this world. They skipped that verse. And the other thing is, he has said that the earth is his footstool. So their theology is flawed in more than one way. But the religious right has basically joined Dominionism, and that's where they're headed, and that is to, basically that's where the culture war starts. Back in this time period, but it's now coming into the front like we have never seen before. Okay, Christian Reconstructionism. Founded by Rushdoony, R.J. Rushdoony, he advances the idea that Christians must not only dominate society, but they must also enforce Old Testament biblical law. And this this is where you get soft dominionists and hard dominionists. The soft dominionists do not enforce the Old Testament biblical law. The hard dominionists, yeah, they'll stone you to death for homosexuality, adultery, theft, rebellious children, whatever it says in the Bible, that's what they will enforce. So they're the hard dominionists. Unlike the doctrines developed within specific denominations, Christian Reconstructionism has been a movement of ideas that transcends denominations, and it has influenced far more people than those who have ever adopted the label. Its main contribution, like I said earlier, was that it gives justifies the mandate of Christians to get involved in politics, that we now have to partake of public policy and get Christianity back into America because of the culture war. We're going to be punished by God. We've lost our mandate. We've let them take over what we should be doing and bringing the nation back to God. So he started his writings in the 1950s, and he brought forth the term Dominion men. And that's what they have been looking for now throughout the movement. The other aspect of Dominionism is the Seven Mountains Dominionism, and it's rooted in a Pentecostal movement of the 1940s, which is the Latter Rain movement that started talking about the fivefold gifts being returned to the church. That then brought out Joel's army, and then that connected to Dominionism. It started in 1948 in Canada, and then it filtered down to America, became the Latter Rain movement, and the New Apostolic Reformation picked up where the Latter Rain movement failed. They picked up the fivefold gifts, the apostles, and the prophets. And of course, it's the leaders of Christian organizations that are the anointed, chosen prophets and leaders, not the person sitting in the pew. The Latter Rain movement taught that there would be an outpouring of supernatural powers in a coming generation. So they're waiting for something big to happen, to have all the miracles and the gifts. So what will they be what will they be overtaken by? The false miracles, the false latter rain, the things, the delusions. The Latter Rain movement has promised along the restoration of the contemporary gifts and offices of apostles and prophets. The teachings give the authority to the apostles, and that they have the key to the theological and structural elements of Dominionism. C. Peter Wagner, who is presently around in these days, who is the founder of the New Apostolic Reformation. And many of the apostles in this group, it's not based on any denomination. Any church denomination can join this Reformation. And they have networks, sometimes composing of up to 10,000 groups of leaders. And a lot of them, these leaders, apostles and prophets, have assumed high-profile positions in religious and civic life. They have really matured over the years. What I put up here on this line was to show an overview, like a drone overview of what happened, cause and effect. And I thought it really interesting that God in His mercy started Americans United for Separation of Church and State in 1948. And that's a prophetic waymark in a number of the lines that Elder Tess has shown. But in 1948 is when the Latter Rain movement revival started. So then Rush Dooney wrote his book on Dominion Men, and then CBN by Pat Robertson was started, and that was because the FCC changed what the television stations could put over the airwaves. So they could now get paid for putting on Christian TV, and he was the first one. And what happened is these people that would go on television would create a new way of making money and creating an identity of an organization. And they used direct mail and telephone for getting donations. But they were very, very, so this was new, and Christians were excited. There was something to watch on TV now on Sunday that had a religious denomination, a religious flavor to it. So that was 1961. In 1962 and 63, prayer was taken out of the school, Bible readings were taken out of the school. Civil rights movement in 1964. National Organization for Women. What do you see? They see this, the Christian right sees this as an attack that has taken away the Christian nation. Oh, now we have Roe v. Wade, the Biblical Institutes written by Rushdoony now that gives the justification for Christians to get into politics is now making a way around the way of these leaders and influencing these people to now get involved in politics. So now they have a justification. They see things happening, but they don't really know, how do you get into politics? We've never gotten into politics. They're still unorganized and not very savvy. So Focus on the Family comes in 1977, and notice these names. It's Focus on the Family, American Family Institute, The Moral Majority with Jerry Falwell, and this is called the Christian Women's Association, Concerned Women Association by Beverly LaHaye, Tim LaHaye's wife. This was organized to counter this because they feared, because they have the mindset that women have a certain place and a certain role in the family, and it's not what these feminists are saying. So they have a counter to that. Here's a Traditional Values, 1980. Francis Schaeffer writes the Christian Manifesto. I'll talk about that a little later. Council for National Policy, that's kind of like the secular version of Council of Foreign Policy, CFR, but I'll talk about that later too. Then we have the Rutherford Institute, which is a Christian version of the ACLU. They'll defend any Christian case to try and promote their agenda. Family Research, Operation Rescue, which is a radical anti-abortion group. And he was influenced by Biblical Institutes, which is this man, Rushdoony. And he said himself, if you want to understand Operation Rescue, you need to read Rushdoony. So he went from being just into anti-abortion into a theocratic now thinking person. Family Research Council. So the Family Research Council began in '83. It started foundering, and then Focus on the Family took it over, and it's actually a lobbying arm to the Senate and the House. Christian Coalition, the Moral Majority comes to an end. The ACLJ, which is the counter of the ACLU, but it's a Christian version. And then the Alliance Defense Fund, which is, again, an alliance of Christian organizations that will defend any kind of what they consider a religious infringement, or an infringement on any religious freedom. So we have this religious right mindset has developed because they believe America is under attack. Their rights are being removed to be able to express their religious beliefs. They think that that's what religious freedom is, that they are now not able to say Merry Christmas. And they're being persecuted because now they can't pray in public schools and they can't have Bible readings, and they therefore justify the decline of the nation is because of that. So they are redefining what religious freedom is. So where was I? There's a man named Frederick Clarkson. He's been studying religious movements and the religious right for 30 years. And he works for the Political Research Association. A lot of my information came from those websites and articles, and then various newspaper articles. But Mr. Clarkson says, it is important to underscore that dominionism, even as it evolves, is not a passing fashion, but a historic trend. This trend featured fierce theological battles in the 1980s that pitted the largely apolitical premillennial dispensationalism that characterized most of 20th century evangelicalism against a politicized, dominion-oriented post-millennialism. So let me rephrase that. He's saying we have people who believe in premillennialism. They're not interested in politics, and the reason they're not interested in politics is because they believe in the rapture. They're not going to go through any tribulation. So there's no need to get involved in politics. Just be a good Christian. The other Christians believe in postmillennialism, and they have a mandate that they have to create a Christian nation or Christ cannot return. So they're actually holding back Christ. They have even said that this could take hundreds or thousands of years before this theocratic nation is created. But that's their drive, and they are very motivated, and they are very organized, and they have a lot of smart people doing things, and they are using the new data, the new technology, just like Cambridge Analytica. And they gather information, and they have armed themselves. It reminds me of the Crusades. They're just like Christian crusaders, and but again, they do not know where they're heading. The turning point of this premillennial, postmillennial battle was 1973 when Rushdoony published his 800-page Institute of Biblical Laws. It's the foundation of dominionism. It advances the dominion mandate, and it's based on Genesis 1:28. He sought to describe, he went through the whole Bible, and he sought to describe what a biblically based Christian society would look like. He had a legal code based on the Ten Commandments and the laws of the Old Testament, and a long list of capital offenses, mostly religious or sexual crimes. So it's moral. Everything's moral. Rushdoony and many of the Reconstructionists also believed strongly in a vastly decentralized form of government. And interestingly, George W. Bush in 2001, a few days after he was elected, created a faith-based initiative program through an executive order, and he brought in all these Christians, and he started defunding social, what are they called? Social funding to help the poor. And then to counter that, he started giving grants to Christian charities, saying that that way they can help the poor people. So basically what he's doing, they're funding churches. They're funding Christian organizations. Because the theme of the Dominionists is, you should not look to the government for help, you should look to God. And they want to decentralize the federal government. They want to make it smaller. They're very much into states' rights as opposed to a strong federal government. And so over the years, he has been shutting down funding for various organizations but creating more grants, and now these Christian organizations and charities are getting this money to do the work, and they're not doing very well. I haven't put a lot of it together yet. I've been collecting the information. A lot of people are left hanging, pretty much. Cutting back on food stamps, cutting back on Medicaid help, various things like that for the safety net that the 60s, the Democrats in the 60s created, and even starting back with FDR, to have a safety net for the minorities. In 1980s, another book was published that had a big impact on the Dominionists, and it was published by Gary North. He's the son-in-law of Rushdoony, who published his book in 1973. And it was about what does a Christian conservative political association look like? See, they're just now learning how to get together, because they're just really in the beginning here, up to the 1990s. They were really not that coalesced. They were just kind of independent organizations. They knew each other, but they were not organized in a unity that they have today. And it happened basically after, starting in the 1990s. Interesting, in 1987, Christianity Today did an article detailing the Reconstructionist theocratic idea. It was one of the first times it was brought out into the public in terms of dominion theology, and Dominionism. And also that year, Bill Moyers did a PBS broadcast on religious right. So we have, in the mid-'80s, it's being brought out into the open, but it didn't take. It just kind of was out there. Now, Francis Schaeffer, he played a big role. He published a book in 1981, and it's called A Christian Manifesto. He was not a Reconstructionist in that he did not want a theocratic United States, but he did say that Christians should get involved in politics. His catalyst for the right wing was he was very opposed to abortion. And that really galvanized the various different movements and organizations that had been developing through the 70s and 80s. He did not believe in the application of the Old Testament for laws against crimes in the United States, but he did agree that Christians should protest, but not in a radical way that the Reconstructionists want to do it. He did say, here's a quote from one of his books, that the common people had the right and the duty to disobedience and rebellion if state officials ruled contrary to the Bible. To do otherwise would be rebellion against God. So it sounds like he is a theocratic, but he says he's not. But yet he's saying Christians have a responsibility and a duty to disobey and rebel if they break the rules of the Bible. There's another historian that's really worthwhile reading. His name is John Fea, F-E-A. And he talks about Schaeffer's role in shaping the Christian rights belief in a Christian America. And they drew the plumb line from the Bible to the Constitution through the Protestant Reformation, and actually said that the things that Christians are facing today, which was in the 80s, is the tyranny that the people in the Protestant Reformation were facing. That's exactly what we're being faced now. That our country, our structure of our society is being attacked and destroyed. So 30 years later, this is a parenthetical, this is page 5 of your notes. The best expression of co-belligerency, which Schaeffer advocated, was put together in the 2009 Manhattan Declaration. It was called A Call of Christian Conscience, and it had a three-part platform of life, marriage, and religious liberty as the conservative believers' defining concerns. It is a document on Wikipedia, and you can actually sign it. And they now have over 551,000 signatures as of 2 weeks ago. And they object to gay marriage. They object to divorce. They are calling for civil disobedience if civil liberties of exercise of religion and freedom of speech are being violated. Well, they consider a violation of their freedom of speech would be for a person who bakes a cake has to bake a cake for a gay marriage. They consider that a violation of their religious freedom to say, no, I don't have to bake that cake for that gay couple, even though I'm in the public marketplace and I'm violating a constitutional discriminatory law. So their words of using violation of free speech is not what the founders described as free speech, is not what the Protestant Reformation was describing in religious freedom. They just want, back then it was freedom to be able to worship as you pleased in a denomination without being persecuted by the state or by other religions. Here they've turned it into personal expression in the workplace, to the point now that doctors and nurses and ambulance drivers can say, no, I will not serve this person because they go against my sincerely believed religious beliefs. That's the exception law that they're creating, that the Trump administration has now been putting out repeatedly since he came into office. And every year it's getting more and more and more, allowing even the federal construction contractors, they can fire people if they're gay and it goes against their sincerely believed religious beliefs. So this is the kind of discrimination that is being perpetrated and advanced, which matches the Christian right, which matches the theocratic vision of the Dominionists, and which Trump is doing. Because these people are very strongly connected to him. The people that are in his inner circle of religious consultation and advice and prayers are Dominionists. But again, the regular Christian person who believes in biblical things doesn't know that these people are taking it to that direction. Yes?
We actually didn't get to that part at the end of my notes, that Paul White has told him that he is a saved man. I don't think we read that he is a saved man and he cannot sin.
Have you ever done a study on Paula White?
But that's the people that are influencing him.
Mm-hmm.
That's the things that are telling him. That he is Cyrus.
He is.
Cannot sin.
Yes. And so what does that do to this egomaniac? Exactly. And I think he's known her since 2012. So this agenda on the Manhattan, the co-belligerency, the strategic partnerships to cooperate on a shared political agenda is now shared by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, much of the evangelical Christian right, and allied politicians in the Republican Party. Schaeffer's work has caused more people to turn to overt dominionism than any other thought leader before. So we see thoughts are being expressed in ideas, and they're being absorbed by other people. We have mind on mind. And this melding of this Christian right mindset with the dominionism, it just reminds me of the Puritans, of the people back there in the beginning of our nation, that there was no opening for any crack of light to come in because they were so They are so convinced that they have this right. And because they're prospering, that's the sign of God's blessing on them. How could I be wrong? Yes.
I think had we not known any of this, what's going on since way back when and continue on how they want, what they're trying to do, had we not studied this, we would have probably been still on that kind of, well, yeah, it's like this because, you took God out of the church, you took God out of school. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But we don't know about this.
Right. What I find fascinating is, and I'm trying to find the documents that Americans United for Separation of Church and State, I'm sure they were writing lots of articles during the 60s and advocating this because they saw that this was unconstitutional. But because of the 50s, the things that were happening in the 50s, and it was okay back then, and now they're being taken out, they see that as an aggressive attack. And now they're back, they're in fight mode. We want to recover what our founders made this nation. How can we not? We would be not good Christians. We would be failing in the sight of God. So it's really how the mind has been manipulated by these events and by the misinterpretation of Scripture. I think there's a quote somewhere I have that says, "He who controls the interpretation of the Bible controls the nation." Oh, wow. In light of how we study and are learning to study how to read the Bible, how to read the spirit of prophecy, and here all of these people pretty much interpret the Bible the same way. And I used to too. I used to think like that, maybe not to that degree. I didn't know anything about a theocratic, vision, but I did think that America was a Christian nation. And I did kind of, prayer does help, why wouldn't we have it in school?
Mindset.
Yeah, it's the mindset. And I grew up in the 50s. And I never even thought about anybody else who's not a Christian. What that must have been like. Even if you, not a Christian, if you were a Hindu, if you were Jewish, whatever.
Yeah. Just like this is a mindset. Now we're learning, about conservatism and stuff like that. When it's not really just all political, it's a mindset.
Yes. And when you combine a Christian mindset with a political mindset, you have church and state, and you have a marriage, and you have danger. You have the 1260. So talking about how Schaeffer's book affected many people is Randall Terry. He's the one that began Operation Rescue in 1986. And he was I don't know if you all remember, but he was a violent protester against abortion. He would stand and not let the doctors go in the building. And they did a lot of dangerous things to harm people, to intimidate people. In fact, excuse me, I don't think he's the one that did bombs. Did he do? Because some of the abortion clinics were bombed, and I don't know if that was him or not. He wrote in his 1995 book, The Sword. Oh no, I'm on the top of page 6. He says, if you need to read Schaeffer's Christian Manifesto if you want to understand Operation Rescue. So he read that book. He began Operation Rescue. So he's doing his rebellion, his what's it called? Civil disobedience, because they are violating the laws of the Bible. He also says, I gladly confess that I want to see civic law in America and every nation restored to and based on the law given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. He considers the law to be flawless, infallible, and unimprovable. It's the very best we could build on. But it is the broad vision that Dominionists share that should be of the greatest interest of concern to those outside the movement. They have adopted a concept called the sphere sovereignty. It's also termed mountains or gates, and it's those 7 I have listed there. It's a conversion of Dominionism and the 7 mountains and the Reconstructionist view. It doesn't require any kind of deep thinking, and it comes down to a very simple sentence. We have an assignment from God to take dominion and transform society. And this is why they have all these Christian colleges and universities that are built are to raise people up that will then go into these 7 areas. And they're going to, it reminds me of a Jesuit thing. That's what they do. They go in. And so I see them raising men and women up to get into all these areas and just work their way up into the various fields. The biggest issue we have in this battle that's been fomenting and developing, which as I was studying, I kept seeing it. I went, wow, they've redefined the words, what religious liberty means or what religious freedom means. Because I've even had conversations with my brother about the baker and the florist who wouldn't serve. Excuse me. And I said, well, what about the constitutional rights? You're discriminating to these people just because of a certain lifestyle that they've chosen. And he says, well, they should have that right. It's their belief. But I thought, well, then why are they in the public market? Because the next thing that goes on their sign is we don't serve Jews, we don't serve SDAs, we don't serve alcoholics, whatever. So I see it as a slippery slope. The religious freedom has actually been seen by Dominionists as a weakness in the constitutional democracy, and that they can use it to exploit and to advance their agendas. Gary North described in 1982, we must use the doctrine of religious liberty to gain independence for Christian schools until we train up a generation of people who know that there is no religious neutrality, no neutral law, no neutral education, no neutral civil government. See, he's already listing some of those 7. Then they will get busy in constructing a Bible-based social, political, and religious order which finally denies the religious liberty of the enemies of God. So if you don't agree with them, you're their enemy, and they will not treat you kindly. Gary North believes that the Constitution generally is a legal barrier to Christian theocracy. But he envisions a day. Does anyone have a cough drop by any chance? A cough drop? I've got a... Thank you. I might need to. Oh, thank you. Talking a lot. He envisions a day when biblically correct Christians can gain enough political power to be able to amend the Constitution to limit access to the franchise and civil offices to communicant members of Trinitarian churches. So already he's got discrimination, and it's only a certain group that are going to be allowed to be in political power. The Rutherford Institute, that was in 1992. He was a friend of Francis Schaeffer, who wrote a Christian manifesto, and he was a protege of Rushdoony. So all these people connect together. His name is John Whitehead. He named it after Samuel Rutherford from the 17th century. He's a theologian from the 17th century. And he asserted that even the king must obey God's laws. The king is not above the law. So the institute was to be strategic. It would represent any kind of Christian, heretical or non-Christian, in cases that would set legal precedences for advancing their vision of Christianity. Dominionist theorists view the Jeffersonian idea of religious equality under the law as inherently tyrannical. That's pretty strong. They would fit right in with the Puritans, right? There are two major stages in the attack on religious liberty. Now, this was written in 1965. So look at everything that's happened up to 1965. First, the state is secularized in the name of freedom. And then second, every prerogative of the church is attacked in an indirect manner so that its right to exist is denied. Everything is exaggerated and extreme. So here is the mindset. This is the thinking that informs many contemporary claims of attacks on the religious liberty and fears of persecution by a secular, totalitarian government. So they're fearful of a tyrannical secular government, but they don't seem to be fearful of a Christian totalitarian government, which is what they're building. The religious liberty arguments are cloaked under the conservative religious agenda. It's increasingly seen everywhere, and sometimes the battles indeed, they baffle the liberals. One of the other things I do is I get newsletters from Intercessors for America. You want to know what's going on in the other side, on the other camp? Get their newsletters. Just like you get the newsletter of Blitz, the right-wing watch, they fill you in on what they're doing. That way you don't miss all the articles because they gather them all up. I subscribe to an LGBTQ website, and they show you all the persecution and things that are happening to the minority of these people, their rights are totally being trampled, and they are being discriminated against in all facets of their life. Dominion has to do with authority and subduing as it relates to society. Dominion means ruling as kings, and they base it on Revelation chapter 1:6, that God has made us kings and priests. So now we see the major issues of the culture war are wrapped in a cloak of religious liberty. That is their true battle. Yes?
So when they took prayer out of the schools,
Mhm.
so they couldn't do that, they still had the choice. People who were Christians still had the choice to, like, say grace or something in school, right? Or was that they're not to even pray in school?
What they took out of the public school was public prayer.
Right.
Private prayer was not removed.
Right. Oh,
So if you wanted to say grace over your meal, you could. But at the time they were actually doing the Lord's Prayer publicly.
right. I was just trying to
Yes.
clarify.
But they don't ever mention that the private prayer was still left there. It's just the public prayer wasn't. And just like they want "In God We Trust" everywhere, slapped on every building, every room, every car, every bus, every public building in the government. That's just one of their first initiatives of getting their agenda pressed, but we'll talk more of that after this. As co-belligerents, they seek to declare their individual and institutional religious consciences are violated in various ways. And if you'll notice in the newspaper and in the news, it's all the time, and it's embarrassing when you think of the people who are Christians around the world whose lives are being destroyed because of their Christian faith, just simply going to a building and worshiping God, and they get murdered or their homes are burned. And we have Christians here going, well, I can't say Merry Christmas, and I'm offended. My Christian liberty is being trampled. I mean, it's just on many levels. It is. It really is. And it's just the power of the mind. And that's what I keep going back to. And the fact that God is bringing this up in our dispensation, to me, was very, very important. And I didn't realize how much of a Christian mindset I had, of a conservative Christian mindset that I had, and my judgmentalism. And I look at these lines, and I look back when I was studying on the Puritans. I could have been one of them. I was to a degree. And I could have gone, I've been many places in my walk wandering around, and the Lord has pulled me back. So, only by God's grace am I not there. But He uses these reform lines to show us what's happening, but it's also to help us for our own reformation, to get us to understand these people who are sincere and who really believe they love God, and they're doing a good thing. And they don't know a lot, that they're being misled and have been given disinformation. And things have been twisted and turned to not have a true understanding and meaning. The other thing that we're noticing, especially through Trump, is that these exemptions that people are being given, they're called religious exemptions, that you will not be prosecuted for violating the Constitution of discrimination because it's based on religion. And it's just called a religious exemption clause. And so that way, if you're an ambulance driver and there's a transgender who gets in a car accident, you can decline to not take them to the hospital. Now, they do say that if there's no one right there to take your place, that you must get them to the hospital. So if there's two ambulance drivers and the driver number one says, I'm not doing it, then driver number two has to step in and drive that person to the hospital. But whether you're a nurse, even if you're a receptionist at a hospital and a gay person comes in, or a transgender, or whoever that you have a religious issue about, you as a secretary can say, I'm not taking your paperwork because of my religious belief. That's how extreme it's gotten. But they have a religious exemption. And these are the new things that Americans United and the ACLU are all fighting in Congress. They're watching these laws and protesting and getting their lawyers on the case. And then, of course, we have the Hobby Lobby issue, where a organization is evangelical and they're considered they have religious liberty to not have to obey the Obamacare and provide contraception. Now, Dominionists and contemporary leaders, they know they have to move very carefully, because if word gets out of what they're trying to do, for sure they're going to lose a lot of followers. So one of the few things they do is they pretend, yes, hypocrites. They use language in a very careful way. They craft what they say. They have talking points that they all agree on and use the same language without people picking up on what their final plan is. There is a group of people called the Quiverful movement, and you've heard of that?
That's the Doug family, all the many children. That
Duggars.
The Duggars.
Duggars.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. They are a movement inside the Christian patriarchy movement, and they envision themselves producing arrows in God's quiver in the war for dominion. And Rushdoony, this guy Rushdoony here, he's the founder of the modern homeschooling, because he didn't want to be in the public school system because it's secular. So he started the homeschooling movement. The Quiverful people are also homeschooling. And this one woman has 6 children, 35 grandchildren, and she says the womb is a powerful weapon. It's a weapon against the enemy. Families in my church have an average of 8 children. And my greatest impact is through my children. And the more children I have, the more ability I have to impact the world for God. Most Quiverful children are homeschooled, and they have an explicit goal of Christian education that is Dominionism. So they're raising these 8 children per church family to believe that they have to take over all these areas to help bring back God. They develop a subculture, a basically Christian bubble that they live in, and have no idea what anybody else is doing outside that bubble. In 2000, how much time do I have, Brother Victor? I'm over? I didn't see that. Okay, let me summarize really quick. Okay. Let's go ahead. And I'll basically say, we'll pick up when we come back that basically what we have here then is the building of the Christian right mindset and organizational. This was in the baby stages. It was in the 1990s and forward that they became more sophisticated. The Christian right created a loose network of religious organizations and made political groups that meet with politicians. They have a dominionism idea of a theocratic America. Their goal is to bring back our rights, our Christian rights, to make this nation back into the nation that it originally was, and it was a nation under God. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for your goodness and mercy. We thank you for your blessings on this sacred day. Lord, thank you for the information that you have brought to us to understand the movements of our time, how they think, and how they work towards their goal. We ask for your grace to understand, to have correct discernment and clarity of mind on these issues, to help us as we approach these last days. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.